Good afternoon. My name is Derek Okubo, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the Agency for Human Rights and Community Partnerships for the City and County of Denver. In just a moment here, we're going to have an interactive exercise with all of you who are here. And I will also introduce our first panel here. Just a few housekeeping things. We will be answering questions after each of these panels. So in your packets, you have an index card. And if you could write down your questions and then pass them down to the end here, and the volunteers will pick them up. The reason why we are doing the questions in this way, one is just because of the size of the crowd, the limited amount of time, but we're also recording this event as well. So the questions will come down here, and then I will ask the panelists your questions. We will be taking a 15-minute break, or maybe a 10-minute break. I'll look to you as far as the time, Kelly. And after this first panel, and then we'll come back, I'll ask you to really try to be back in your seats, ready to go so that we can kick off this second panel. So here in this first section, we have three distinguished panelists that I'll introduce to you real quick. We have Nathan Woodliff Stanley, who is the Executive Director of the ACLU of Colorado. And we're really happy that you're here, Nathan. Next to Nathan, we have Kit Taintor, who is the works with the Colorado. Let me get your title here. Okay, it is all my forms.
I can help you out.
Okay, Colorado State. Let me get this.
It's the State Refugee Coordinator.
Yep, State Refugee Coordinator with the Colorado Department of Human Services, and she oversees the Colorado Refugee Services Program.
Yes.
Got it.
There.
Okay. And then lastly, Jerome De Herrera. Good to see you, Jerome. And Jerome is the General Counsel for Denver Public Schools. So let's give our first panelist a hand. In your packets, here's my prop. In your packets, you have these two cards, okay? And so what we're going to do here, I'm going to ask some questions, and then you will hold up your cards if it is a truth or if it is a myth, okay? And I'm going to ask these questions. If I could ask the three of you to help me kind of take a look and kind of gauge if it's 1/2, 1/3, 1/4. But the questions that we have, the first one, immigrants and refugees do not pay taxes. Look at that. If you take a look around, what do you say? Vast majority myth?
Same myth.
Almost.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's look at the next one, and that is true. I mean, they do pay taxes,
You're
correct?
right.
Yeah, they do pay taxes. It is a fact that they pay taxes. Second question. All schools are safe zones for children and their parents. Myth or fact? So what would you say?
Oh, gosh, that's...
Pretty 50-50.
50-50.
I would say it looks like I have some work to do.
The correct answer is no. Schools are not safe zones for children and their parents. Okay? Next question. When someone is pulled over in a routine traffic stop, the police can ask about his or her citizen status. What would you say on that? In Colorado. In Colorado. Okay.
It's pretty mixed.
50-50 or so. The fact is yes, they can ask about the citizen status, but it's up to the officer's discretion. Police can pretty much ask any question they desire, you know, as far as when they are in that contact. Okay? So with that, let me just start off. The first question is, you saw these responses. I mean, what comes to mind when you saw the half and half in that first question where most people knew? So, did you want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, I think that what it tells us is there's a lot of myths and, missing information out there. As we talked before, immigration has definitely picked up in its interest. But we're kind of catching up and being able to educate people, if you will, around the different nuances of immigration or refugee resettlement.
What comes to mind for you, Jerome?
What comes to mind is that it depends on what you mean by certain terms. is a school a safe zone for children and for their parents? Depending on what your definition of a safe zone is, I think that depends on the answer. And my response would be yes, these are safe places. So a lot of it depends. And as a good lawyer, I start most of my answers with it depends.
What about you, Nathan?
Well, you see both the uncertainty about where am I safe, where am I not safe. I mean, that is certainly there. I was a little surprised it was as unanimous or nearly unanimous as it was on the question about taxes, because, and it may say something about this room, because there's certainly plenty of people out there who don't believe that undocumented immigrants are paying taxes, when in fact, as you heard, not only are they paying about $15 billion a year into Social Security that, for the most part, they'll never get back. They're also paying another $12 billion a year into sales and property and income and excise taxes. And I mean, certainly there's a lot of tax payments that come from the undocumented community. So good that you know that. Not everyone does.
So my second question to you is, and we'll just go down the line, Jerome, you could kick us off on this one, is, how have you seen this issue as far as the immigration debate and evolve over time, change over time?
From our own experience in Denver, in our schools, we see the impacts in kids and in their families and in the schools on just a more regular, more frequent basis. I believe that there have been immigration actions, removals and such for years, but it hasn't risen to the level of our Board of Education, our superintendent, or my office. Now we hear about it and we see what is happening, and when we get a call that says one of our fourth graders' moms has been picked up, it sits right there in front of us, and it's something that touches us much closer than it had been before, where we wouldn't receive those calls, so we wouldn't understand and we wouldn't feel that impact that our kids are now feeling. So the impacts of immigration actions have now risen to the very top of our of the school board of the school system.
What about you, Kit? How have you seen it change over time?
Well, we exist. I think that pre-Paris, most folks in Denver didn't realize that we resettled refugees. Most folks in Colorado probably didn't know about it. But we've really kind of come front and center in the last 18 months, where people are understanding that maybe the reason that you do eat pho across the street from the Capitol is because of a refugee family. The reason that we have a lot of diversity in our schools is because we've always taken part in this refugee resettlement. And so I think that's been the biggest change for us, kind of being a smaller program. Less than 1% of the immigrants in Colorado came as refugees, so we tended to be like a really small kind of phrase at the end of the sentence, and all of a sudden we're kind of at front and center, where we're talking about in the context of larger immigration reform, as our speaker just did. So that's been the big change for us. On a personal level, I think for our refugees is that same flip. They're being seen as refugees when they walk down the streets, where maybe a couple of years ago people wouldn't have known that, and that both has a positive and a negative kind of attribution for it. I think probably a lot of folks in the audience, realizing that people are taxpayers and things like that, realize the strengths and the diversity that these refugees bring us, but not everybody holds that same opinion. And so if you see somebody walking down the street and you think that they might be a refugee, you might hold an entirely different sort of perception of who that person is and what you might perceive as that threat to the community. So I think it's been a whole host of things that have been thrown onto us in the last 18 months, and it's come really fast and furious and caught us a little bit off guard. I like to say that the Refugee Act of 1980, which set up the system for refugee resettlement, passed unanimously in the Senate. Like, what passes unanimously in the Senate? And the refugee resettlement program did. And so that's been the big kind of switch for us, is realizing that we used to be something that people thought was kind of our humanitarian values and really about kind of the core of who our nation was. And in the last 18 months has been very much of, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? And that determines how you feel about refugee resettlement.
Nathan?
Well, certainly this this issue has had a big impact on the ACLU. The ACLU was immediately put in the spotlight after the travel ban that was aimed at Muslims and refugees, and the immediate response to that, and the courts putting a stop to that within 16 hours after it was put into effect. Immigration is an issue that the ACLU has worked on for a while. We've worked with partner organizations around things like tuition equity and repealing the SB 90R, show me your papers law that we had here before in Colorado, and driver's licenses, and more recently things like notario abuses. There are a lot of different things that we have worked on. In particular, our legal department, Mark Silverstein, our legal director, really worked on the legal theory that was sent to the sheriffs all around the state that led to really the entire state of Colorado at the local level not honoring ICE detainers anymore. These detainers where it's around holding somebody for extra time after they're supposed to be released for ICE to come and check their immigration status. But it is so much. I mean, that had actually sort of gone down on our agenda. Immigration concern. We work on a lot of different issues at the ACLU, and that had become less at the top of the list, and now it's right back up at the top of the list. It hit me very personally. My work before I went to the ACLU was as a Unitarian Universalist minister, and I'm currently still a community minister affiliated with First Unitarian in Denver, which is the congregation that gave sanctuary to Jeanette Vizgara and Arturo before her. And so it's seeing the very personal impact of it. As a minister, it's not a big surprise to have somebody call you in tears. As the director of the ACLU, it's a surprise to have people calling in tears, and they have been, because there are people really afraid. They're terrified. They don't know what's going to happen, where ICE is going to be, where they're safe, where they're not safe. There's a lot of fear in the community. We've just since the election, as this has risen on our agenda, we've done more than 50 Know Your Rights trainings, mostly in Spanish, just on immigration-related issues. We've trained attorneys with partner organizations like Remain on bond hearings around detention, and we've had a lot of volunteers who've come forward to the ACLU, and we found people who are willing to serve as translators for organizations like Remain. And it is now, as I said, very much at the top of our list. We've worked on a lot of sort of policy issues at both the state level. Pretty much nothing good or bad passed in the legislature this year on this issue. But we've worked with local governments. For example, this 364 policy with Denver, and we're looking at other locations where, and this is even primarily about people who are documented but are not citizens, who can be deported if they're arrested for something that has a penalty of 1 year or more. So if we can change some of those smaller municipal penalties to 364 days instead of a year, then it doesn't trigger that. And those are the kinds of sort of obscure but impactful policies that we're continuing to work on. And again, with partners like CERC and other organizations, we work a lot in coalition with other organizations on all of the issues we work on. So it has absolutely changed our work a lot. It's made it a very much a forefront part of what we do, and will probably continue to be the case as we go forward.
So in our introduction, in our exercise, we talked about 3 myths and facts. I mean, what fact comes to mind that most people don't know, but you want people to know? And I'll just kind of throw it out there and let whoever wants to go first go first. Is there any fact, or maybe even a myth? I'll just say that you hear a lot.
Yeah, I can go down my list.
Sure, yeah.
I think we've had a lot of myths out there. We hear that there's a refugee crisis in the United States and in Colorado. That's simply not true. Refugee resettlement is a planned process. I can tell you how many refugees we expect to resettle next year or this year. Most years I can. This year is a little bit wonky, but last year I could have. So it's a very planned process. They're not refugees going to Bent County. That's just not happening in Colorado. We hear hear that refugees make communities less safe. MPI did a study that said that actually refugees make communities more safe. They looked at some cities where the refugee resettlement was at a certain threshold of per capita of that city, and looked at crime rates after refugee resettlement began, and actually found that crime went down to the tune of 62% in Clarkston, Georgia, and over 70% in Dearborn, Michigan. So refugees are actually contributing to the safety of these local communities in which they resettle. We hear that refugees don't want to be like us, and we find that actually refugees want jobs, they want education for their families, and especially here in Colorado, they embody the very rugged individualism that we appreciate as Coloradans. They picked themselves up, they got themselves here, and they want to make something of themselves. So refugees are very much like us. We hear everything from, refugees, don't want to celebrate American holidays. We actually did a 5-year longitudinal study, which found that refugees actually really love American holidays, specifically 4th of July and Thanksgiving. So we hear a lot of these myths coming out, and we're happy to be able to counter it with facts, because facts are kind of the basis of what we discuss. The other one that I always like to throw out as well, and then I'll hand it over to my other panelist, is that refugees don't want to work. I think is a really interesting one. You can imagine, have any of you been unemployed for a really long period of time? You get bored, right? You get, you don't really want to get out of bed. You're not really sure what to do with your day. Well, imagine that was your life and you weren't able to provide for your family for years and years on end. We find refugees show up and they say, when can I start working? Right now, refugees are starting work 51 days after they arrive in Colorado. Do you understand how fast that is? When I moved to Colorado, it took me 6 months to get a job, any job, and I knew the language. So 51 days, which includes getting your EAD card, your Social Security card, finding your house, getting your kids safely on a bus. 51 days is amazing. So those are my quick myths and myth busters.
Do you want to go next, Nathan?
Sure. I think some of those same myths are set around immigrants more generally, too. The idea that immigrants make us less safe, or our communities less safe, the idea that immigrants are hurting our economy, and that we need to deport people for the sake of our economy. These are very wrong-headed ideas. Economically, and while there's disputed numbers, economists almost all agree that it would be very harmful to our economy if we were to actually deport large numbers of people. And in fact, the Center for American Progress estimated that it would cost, if we really did mass deportations of undocumented residents in our country, that it would cost the American economy $4.7 trillion over the next 10 years. It would be a disaster, actually. And with regard to safety, the concern we see around safety is that when you have all of this really aggressive enforcement of immigration laws, what happens in local communities is that people become afraid. They become afraid to report crimes. They become, women who are victims of domestic violence don't call the police. People don't report crime. It's actually really bad for safety to have local law enforcement engaged in doing the work of federal immigration, and it breaks down trust between communities and local law enforcement in a way that makes all of us less safe. And so the notion that sanctuary cities, for example, would be less safe, it's the exact opposite. They're safer than places where that type of connection between local law enforcement and ICE is occurring.
Mm-hmm. Jerome?
I think Kit and Nathan said it really well, but to be even more blunt, I think it's very much a wrong-headed myth to say that undocumented people are not what you want in your society. These are folks who have sacrificed greatly of their own lives and of whatever treasure they had to make a better life for themselves and for their kids. And that's all about sacrifice, courage, ambition, doing something to improve your kids' future. And if those aren't the ideals that you want to build a society on, I don't know what you want to build a society on. So when you hear politicians say that these are undesirables, that these are the people we need to kick out, I think that's very much a wrong-headed myth, and it's the opposite. But our discourse doesn't allow for that for many different reasons. But to think that these individuals, these families, and these people, that those ideals are not the ones we want to build a society on, are wrong-headed. I'll take sacrifice, courage, ambition any day of the week.
I'd like to add one other myth,
sure.
which is the idea that our Constitution only grants rights to citizens. If you look at the language in the Constitution, most of the rights that are granted in the Constitution are to people, not to citizens. And it is important for us to remember that.
Good point. Kit, you had mentioned how the statistic, it makes refugees make communities safer. For those folks who don't know, can you explain how that works as far as the underlying factors and that impact?
Well, I can speculate.
Okay.
I think as to why that is. So, refugees come. They don't have very much when they arrive. A bag maximum. And so they tend to move into areas of the city that are low income. They tend to move into apartment complexes that are vacant. They tend to walk places. They tend to take public transportation, which creates street traffic. They tend to open grocery stores nearby those apartments that can maybe serve the community by having ethnic food. So they create these businesses, these revitalizations. Clarkston, Georgia is actually a really great example of this, as is St. Louis and some of the Rust Belt communities, where when refugees came in, they created a neighborhood where the neighborhood had left for whatever reason in years past, and had really filled in those urban areas that didn't have the same population density that made them safe. So I think that those are some of the factors. And then again, refugees are really fleeing a lot of violence and feeling of being unsafe. And so I think that when they come here, they want to do the opposite for themselves and their families and their neighbors, and help create that feeling of safety and security.
Other insights? Anyone else?
I'd like to build on Nathan's point about constitutional rights, because it's very important in the public education realm. The Supreme Court ruled in a famous case that all students, whether you're documented, whether you're a citizen or not, have a right to a public education. And it's a landmark case. It's called Plyler v. Doe, and it's stood the test of time. And it's that constitutional right that all kids have, whether you're a citizen or not, whether you're documented or not, regardless of who your parents are. You have that right to come to our schools or any school where you live and get a free public education. And there's human rights issues, there's public policy rationale behind it, there's also the legal constitutional rationales behind it. But I don't think anybody, unless you're a lawyer who focuses on this, understands that. But all students have that right. It's a constitutional right. It's been vindicated at the highest levels of our courts, and that is why I disagree with you respectfully. I think our schools are safe havens because of that protection that came from the Supreme Court. So I think it's important for people to know, because it's a myth that people just don't know about.
Let's talk a little bit about our hopes, our optimism, what we would like to see. I mean, what comes to mind for you as far as what you would like to see happen in the future? I mean, we're in this space right now. What are some of the opportunities and what you would like to see? Who wants to start?
I'd be happy to start.
Okay, thank you, Jerome.
In my ideal state, I would like to see political leaders focus on priorities that will advance us as a society. And I think focusing on undocumented immigrants is, it shouldn't be anywhere on the list of priorities to make us a better society. And so I would like to see a political world where our political leaders are doing good public policy that advances us as a society. But I think we're at this point in my life where our discourse is just awful, and our political leaders are not able to do that, and that's unfortunate. So you asked me what my dream is, that's my dream.
Very good.
I guess I have a couple of different dreams on a couple of different levels, if you will. On a local level, I guess the dream is to really capture the energy that has come out of the last couple of months and turn it into action. That can be action as far as volunteerism, that can be action as far as advocacy, that could be action as far as donations to the agencies that serve refugees and immigrants. On a more national or international level, we talked before about how the refugee numbers fluctuate from year to year. And in the past, that's always been as a result of what's going on overseas. And so the numbers would increase, let's say, if there was a need overseas for there to be a durable solution for people who were fleeing persecution. What we've seen instead in the past couple months is going back into what's actually in the Refugee Act, and that's that number of 50,000 refugees to come in both this year and next year. And so it's really kind of ignoring these pressures that these other communities and other nations have, and kind of going back to the minimum instead of looking at the numbers that we could support as a member of our global community in response to what is the largest refugee crisis of our time.
What makes me the most optimistic right now is the outpouring of people. I mean, all the people that were out at the airport, the people that have gone out on marches, that are stepping forward to groups like the ACLU and CERC and other organizations that care about this work. I mean, obviously, the dream in the long run, and unfortunately, I don't see this happening very soon, but I hope we can get to the point that we can have the kind of comprehensive immigration reform that we heard about in the keynote address. That's really what we need. And in the shorter term, I hope that we can change the public discourse, and I hope people will reject the propaganda that is out there against immigrants and refugees. I mean, something like this Voice program that victims of immigrant crime and sort of highlighting crimes that have been committed by immigrants is pure propaganda. Immigrants are no more likely, in fact, probably less likely to commit crimes than other segments of the population. And you could do that with anybody. You could pick any segment of the population, find crimes that had been committed by that segment of the population, and try to create the impression that this was a criminal element. It has been done other times in history, and it's very dangerous. And we should not be falling for that kind of propaganda. I'm hopeful that people are starting to shift and turn on this and realize that that is dangerous propaganda, and that our immigrant neighbors are us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we just have about 10 minutes left. A question that has popped into my mind, and I just want to ask your opinion. What do you feel would happen if we lost DACA?
It's pretty scary. I mean, you have a lot more fear, a lot more, and it depends on how it was then acted upon, whether you actually would have substantial numbers of DACA recipients being deported. You're talking about human tragedy.
Yep.
Families ripped apart, futures being wrecked, people going back to places that they don't even have any memory of. I mean, there's the legal side of this, but then there's just the human side of it. There's no way that we can have mass deportations without just enormous human tragedy. And I hope that doesn't happen.
I think human tragedy is the right phrase, and I would add an unnecessary human tragedy for very, very minimal, if any, benefit at all, except for political purposes.
Yep. Anything to add, Kit?
No, just from the refugee perspective, we, the folks here, do have legal status. So while they share many of the same barriers that are undocumented friends do, they're not necessarily affected by these sorts of changes.
So just the last question before we break, and then I'll do some housekeeping. But what type of policies do you feel need to be in place in order to create that healthier environment that we want our immigrants and refugees to experience here in our community?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a starting point, and it really is only a starting point, but it's to make sure that our local communities, that we in every way are doing everything we can at the state level and at the local level to protect our immigrant and refugee communities, to protect local law enforcement from being co-opted by federal immigration forces, and to make our communities as genuinely safe as we can until we get to the point that we can really have the kind of reform that we ought to have.
Kit?
Well, I think that whether you're a refugee or you're an immigrant, you see, or whether you're an American, you see Colorado, you see America as a land of opportunity. And so I think the question for us is how do we develop policies that make it the land of opportunity for everyone? And so when you think about the workforce issues that we're developing, you know, we're seeing changes in the refugee population that's coming in. So we talked a little bit about the changes in the overall immigrant population, but what we're seeing here locally and what we're seeing across the United States is that the refugee population is more educated than it's been in the past 5 or 10 years. We're seeing a lot of people come in with engineering degrees or computer or technology degrees, doctors, nurses, lawyers, and we're really creating barriers for them to kind of refine their careers once they're here. So I think that's one of the policies that would be really helpful in just sort of streamlining that process for people who do come in here with high skill sets and how they get reattached to those jobs that they performed in their home countries, but also in places where we could use a little bit of extra help, if you will, in our workforce.
Jerome closes out.
I would say better protections for our most vulnerable community members. Immigrants and refugees are some of our most vulnerable community members, and we need better policies to protect them. I think empathy is something that is easily forgotten. And if we were to put ourselves in their shoes, and if we had to leave our homelands and cross borders and cross deserts and cross rivers to try to provide a better life for ourselves and our families, how would we feel if we were in their shoes? And I think empathy is often forgotten, and I think these are some of our most vulnerable folks, and I don't think we have we remind ourselves that they need protections, because there are folks in our society who will take advantage of the most vulnerable, and they will, and they do, and we need to step up as a society and do what we can to prevent that.
Very good. Let's give our panelists a hand.